Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, An Expert's Guide to RCRA Training. We're glad you could join us. My name's James, I run webinars and events here at Triumvirate Environmental, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before I turn things over to our speaker, just want to give you some information on what you can expect over the next hour as we run through a few housekeeping items. You may have noticed that your microphone is muted. We ask that if you have a question or a technical issue, to please use the questions box over on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll address those as they come in. Following the presentation, there will be an open Q&A period. You don't have to wait till the very end. You can get questions in anytime throughout the webinar, and we'll take them as they come in at the end of the webinar. If we don't get to all the questions, keep in mind we will be following up with you in the next couple of days to make sure that your question is answered. And finally, we'll be sending you a copy of the recording and the slide deck in an email tomorrow morning, so keep an eye out for that. Our speaker today is Doug Graham. Doug is EHS Practice Director, heading up our training services at Triumvirate Environmental. He's got over 24 years of EHS training, consulting, auditing, and program development experience, and has provided over 12,000 hours of training. Doug is a nationally recognized trainer, guest instructor, course developer, and a contributing author for EHS Journal. And so, Doug, I'll let you take it over from there.
Thanks, James, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon. If you're with us live for our record training topic, which is actually an encore presentation. We did this a while back, and it was a popular webinar, so we're bringing it back. A little disclaimer there, this is not actual record training. I'm guessing most of you understand that. So we're talking about the training requirements nationally, and I'm going to be talking about the ins and outs of the EPA as well as state training requirements, and so everybody gets a good perspective on this topic. One of the things we're going to be focusing on is that there are a lot of differences between the states when it comes to the training requirements, and there are also differences related to generator status as well, and also emphasizing that record training is consistently pretty high ranking on the list of common RCRA violations. You know, for those EPA regions that keep track of this and come up with their top 10 lists periodically, as well as some state programs that also track common violations. Training is always high on the list, often coming in the top 3, if not number 1, especially for larger generators. So this webinar is really targeted towards people that have record keeping and training responsibilities internally, like HR might be involved in the record keeping piece of RCRA, EH&S managers obviously, you know, that have compliance responsibilities, as well as individual employees. So we'll talk a little bit about here the difference between, you know, checking the box and having training that engages employees, as well as hits all the regulatory, the key issues, and explains the requirements in a way that everybody can understand. So sometimes it is a challenge to capture all the employees and give them exactly what they need in the detail in which they need to hear it to keep you in compliance. So the key objective with this webinar is to understand what the hazardous waste training requirements are. And that would include things like the qualifications of the instructor, recurrence when refresher training is required, how much time needs to be devoted to it, what topics need to be covered in what level of detail. And so we're going to actually drill down right into the EPA language of the training requirements and kind of dissect that too. Okay, so the 4 big takeaways for this webinar would be what employees are required to be trained, so how those requirements are applicable to individual employees, how requirements can vary state by state, and the kind of the 2 key pieces you want to look at in your state program. That would be generator status, as well as any changes in the language. So if the state program has varied from EPA, that's something you need to be aware of. Recurrence, how annual training is sometimes required for some generators in some states, and developing a curriculum. Okay, so we're going to start with an overview on who needs RCRA training and how much they need. So the first thing we need to realize is that there are a lot of states that have their own RCRA programs, and it's important to read those individual training requirements in your own state's environmental department's rules. The federal regulatory basis is the EPA, of course, in the 40 CFR. There's been some recent changes to where the training requirements are found in the 40 CFR. They did do some reorganization, as many of you are probably aware, as a result of the EPA generator improvements rule. Okay, so one of the first things that's mentioned in the training requirements, the EPA training requirements, is that they use the term facility personnel, which is really just implying employees of the employer of the generator of the hazardous waste. And the facility personnel who need training would include, we've got a couple of slides on this, basically anybody who is performing hazardous waste related tasks. And so we created a couple of bullet lists here of some of the common activities that would bring the employee into the training requirements. One would be, of course, characterizing waste as either hazardous or non-hazardous. So that's often referred to as waste characterization or profiling wastes. A waste information profile is the document for regularly generated waste that's required by the facilities that receive the waste, and it's really the certification of what the waste is. And generators typically are the ones that are certifying that document, and of course that's a key role in waste characterization, that employee who's authorizing the profiles. People that could be the liaison or the conduit between the employer and government officials from either the EPA or from the state environmental authority, certainly need to be trained in these requirements. Could be an interaction with the waste vendor, scheduling pickups, confirming which wastes are being scheduled for disposal and so on. Could be also choosing disposal sites. Could be internal inspections people are performing at accumulation areas, which could include both containers and or tanks. Some states do have an inventorying of hazardous waste that's required, so if your state has that, whoever's maintaining those inventory logs would be an important person to include. Record-keeping responsibilities, of course. Manifest signers are a big piece of the puzzle. Those are the people that are authorizing the shipment, and so that's a key piece, key employees to have trained. Depending on your state, you could have a biennial reporting obligation. This is going to depend on state and generator status. Some states also have an annual hazardous waste report, so anybody involved in those filings would want to be included. Marking and labeling of hazardous waste containers. Maintaining the main accumulation area or storage area or short-term storage area, whatever your state refers to it as. This is where the containers are accumulating prior to transport, so whoever's maintaining those areas or inspecting them. Tank management, if you happen to have tanks of hazardous waste. Managing satellite containers. That could include a lot of employees. You may have some employees that have very limited responsibilities and maybe only related to satellite containers. They have to be included, again, unless your state specifically exempts them, and that does happen on occasion. Assisting in compliance issues, so EH&S people or people that assist in compliance. Residue containers, empties. Emergency response, including reporting releases. Emergency coordinators certainly should be aware of all these requirements, and people that actually load or transport the hazardous waste. So curriculum-wise, going back to that, the curriculum can be customized to the employee. So you don't have to cover, in other words, topics that are not applicable to a specific employee. So it's very much task related. We'll get into curriculum coming up a little bit more. Okay, so how much, how often, instructor, record keeping, we're going to bite into all these topics. Okay, the federal training requirements. So we're going to start by looking at and dissecting the EPA training rules. And again, they have been reorganized in the 40 CFR. They're now under Part 262, whereas previously they were referenced in Part 265, which is the section for treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. So it did make the old regulations were a little more challenging to read because there was cross-referencing going on. They did simplify that by putting the requirements all in Part 262, where the generator requirements are. However, they didn't actually change any of the language of the training requirements. So no substantive change to the requirements as far as training goes in the recent EPA changes. So that's good news. So breaking down the federal rules, again, now these are broken down by large quantity generators and then small quantity generators. The requirements are vastly different, and we're going to look at each. Large quantity generators are the ones that are a lot more vulnerable during inspections because the requirements are a lot more in depth, and especially on the record keeping side. So this is how it breaks down in section 262.17. The training requirements for large quantity generators are in paragraph A7, and we're actually going to look at each one of these paragraphs individually. So this slide gives you an overview of the 8 specific paragraphs, and then we're going to break it down. Okay, so the first paragraph mentions facility personnel must successfully complete a program. Now, they don't actually define successfully complete, so this is something that's a bit subjective. It could include a competency evaluation. It could include a test that's created by the employer. It could be successful completion is defined as attendance. So it really can be defined any way you like, but so it is kind of a general statement. But it does imply a somewhat performance-based, and again, there's a lot of flexibility on how that could be interpreted. The second paragraph talks about the qualifications of the instructor. That is has to be directed by a person trained in hazardous waste management procedures. Some states will alter that statement to have some more specific language. So you want to be, with any of this, you want to be careful with your state program and read the state requirement very carefully. But on a federal level, this is just that one very general statement about the trainer having to have been trained themselves in the topic. So it's really up to the employer to decide who they feel is qualified to present the training. This could be an employee, it could be outsourced to a third party like a consultant or a private training company, but that's for the employer to decide. Okay, curriculum-wise, they don't talk about a specific curriculum. They just use the terms personnel hazardous waste management procedures. They do mention emergency procedures as well. So this is where non-applicable topics do not have to be covered. So for example, if an employee simply manages satellite containers of hazardous waste, then the training can focus, for that population of employees, the training can focus strictly on the standards related to managing those containers and does not have to include things such as filling out or authorizing hazardous waste manifests, inspecting accumulation areas, and the like. So these programs can be very, very customized to individual groups of employees. Okay, again, they do mention responding to emergencies. And anything that's site-specific related to chemical spills or other emergencies related to hazardous waste need to be either included in the training or covered in a separate training. And they do give guidance on the relationship between the OSHA HAZWOPER standard and RCRA. So that's coming up here shortly. Okay, so again, they're not requiring emergency response training during the RCRA session unless it's not being provided otherwise. Okay, so the most common emergency response related training standard outside of RCRA is, of course, the Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response, or HAZWOPER standard under the OSHA regulations. And specifically paragraph Q, so that's 29 CFR 1910-120 paragraph Q, describes the training requirements for employees who respond to releases of hazardous constituents. Okay, there are 3 levels under the HAZWOPER training standard for emergency responders. There's awareness level, which is sort of the general population of employees who could be the discoverer of an incident. There's operations level, which is for employees who manage the incident or help manage the incident, but at a safe distance in a defensive mode. And then there's more extensive training for technicians who are tasked with potentially entering the risk area, the exclusion zone, and wearing personal protective equipment to deal with the spill. So this, of course, is not a HAZWOPER webinar. We'd be getting into a lot more detail on that, but that's where the point is, covering your emergency preparedness and spill management under HAZWOPER fulfills the RCRA emergency response training requirement. Okay, a 6-month window is given for new employees or employees that now have hazardous waste responsibilities who did not previously. They shouldn't be working unsupervised in terms of their hazardous waste duties, but you do have a nice 6-month window there to get them into the formal training. Okay, there is an annual review for large quantity generators, so this implies a retraining, a recurrent training, or refresher training, whatever term you like. And this is annually is generally interpreted as 365-day period. So the expectation is that you would not go over that 1-year period. This, on a state level, this also could be extended down to smaller generators where they're also required to be trained annually, but on a federal level, it's strictly for large quantity generators, and they are silent with regard to recurrence when it comes to small quantity generators. Okay, they're very, very specific on the training records that have to be maintained by a large quantity generator. And this is probably one of the biggest areas of non-compliance that I've seen over the years. Specifically a job title, obviously besides the person's name, a job title related to hazardous waste or connected to hazardous waste responsibilities has to be included in the training record. The next one is probably the most violated provision. There has to be a description of the employee's specific duties related to hazardous waste. This could be sort of a checklist of hazardous waste duties, or it could be a detailed job description. And then the statement that there should be, this record also should include a requisite skill, education, or other qualifications. That is often dealt with by including things like emergency response training, DOT hazardous materials training, or experience-based description to go along with the training record. Okay, there is a 3-year record-keeping requirement, but this is after the employee has no longer works for the employer. So any current personnel all their previous training records have to be maintained throughout the duration of employment. Only after they've left can they does the 3-year window kick in. So this is another area of non-compliance that's quite common. It's conceivable that an inspector could ask for 20 years worth of annual training records if the employee's been working there for 20 years and has had hazardous waste responsibilities for all those 20 years. So expired certificates and all that, keep those. Again, 3 years after they no longer work there, they can be discarded. Okay, on to small quantity generators on a federal level. That's it. So we've just got one sentence there in section 262.16. The generator must ensure that all employees are thoroughly familiar with proper waste handling and emergency procedures relevant to their responsibilities during normal facility operations and emergencies. Nothing related to record keeping is described, nothing related to recurrence, such as annual requirement, not there. Nothing related to curriculum, nothing related to the qualifications of the instructor, just that simple statement. So you've got a lot of flexibility on how you document that. And again, unless the state specifically says otherwise, small quantity generators only have to be trained. Employees only have to be trained initially. It's then up to the employer to decide if they want to do a refresher periodically to keep the employees fresh. Okay, very small quantity generators, and these folks used to be known as conditionally exempt small quantity generators in most states. The EPA's changed the language, so now the conditionally exempt generators are now referred to as VSQGs. The regulations are completely silent on training, so it's implied clearly that the employees should know what they're doing and keeping the employer in compliance. So VSQGs are well advised to do some level of training to ensure that, but there is no specific training requirement. Okay, our next topic is how do the states deal with the federal training requirements? And the answer is it depends where you are. So 48 out of 50 states do have authorized RCRA programs on a state level. So those programs are administered by the state's environmental authority, whether they're referred to as the Department of Environmental Protection or Environmental Quality or Environmental Management, depends what the state, what they call themselves. But again, 48 out of 50 states will either adopt the federal regulations or they will modify them. Now, the totality of the state programs cannot be less stringent than EPA's, but they can be more stringent. So it's really about checking your own state's hazardous waste regulations and looking at those training requirements. The two states that did not have state authorized programs are Alaska and Iowa. So those are actually administered by EPA directly. There are also some territories that that are administered by EPA or follow EPA regulations directly. Federal tribes, Samoa, the Marianas, U.S. Virgin Islands, and so on. Puerto Rico falls under that category as well. However, EPA doesn't directly administer that program, but it is all federal requirements in Puerto Rico. There are two states that by statute incorporate the federal rules by reference. So anytime there's a federal rule change, boom, automatically New Jersey and Pennsylvania will adopt those federal rule changes according to the EPA's schedule. So since we did have a recent change in the generator requirements on a federal level, the EPA generator improvements rule, those changes have already gone into effect in those two states. But that leaves the rest of them. So, for example, the New England states, California, a lot of the Midwest states, they do have state programs, and you should expect some modification to the RCRA requirements in those states. by next summer, because there is a mandate under the EPA Generator Improvements Rule that state programs adopt any provisions of the new federal rules that are more stringent. So I would say, watch your state programs, pay attention to the websites, look for updates. I would guess most of these states will be making some, at least proposed changes, I'm guessing by the spring probably, because the deadline is next summer to make those changes. Okay, so state programs, how do they alter or potentially alter the federal training requirements? Again, this is very state by state. It's kind of all over the place. But the first thing you have to determine is, what's your generator status for your facility as defined by your own state? This can get a little tricky because sometimes they use the same language as EPA, but actually put a different meaning on the terms. So, for example, a small quantity generator in New Hampshire is not the same as a small quantity generator as defined by EPA. So this can certainly create some confusion. So, and sometimes they also use other terms such as full quantity generator, fully regulated generator. So you got to be really careful on reading the state definition of generator size, and then matching that to what the training requirements are for that specific generator definition. Okay, step 2 is reading those requirements. And again, they often do mimic the federal standards, but they can go a lot further. And states that, historically do a lot of altering to federal rules, you can probably expect some alterations there in the RCRA program as well. Here's some examples, East Coast examples, with all apologies to those of you who may be chiming in from another part of the country. But a couple of New England examples. New Hampshire has, the only one I'm aware of is they actually require at least one person from every, what they call full quantity generator facility, to attend a training session that's offered by the state itself, by the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. That's known as hazardous waste coordinator training. They even have coverage requirements in New Hampshire. So you have to have 2 people trained if the first coordinator is not at work for so many days a year, so many hours a week. So that's the only one in the nation I'm aware of that goes to that length. Rhode Island's another interesting example. They recently really beefed up the training requirements to even have very specific curriculum requirements and instructor qualifications that go way beyond EPA's. Maryland does what a lot of the state programs do, and they include smaller generators into the large quantity generator requirements, including the training requirements. So all those LG requirements we went through for training, a lot of states will extend those to small generators as well. So again, be careful on how they define the terms, and then look at the applicable requirements for that generator size. Okay, what happens if we don't follow the rules? Now, EPA did amend their penalty, their civil penalty basis fairly recently, and the RCRA program had a near doubling of the maximum civil penalty basis. So under RCRA now, any violation of the RCRA law can lead to a maximum civil penalty of $70,117, up from, I believe it was $37,500 previously. Another worrisome aspect of the penalty matrix is that that is a per violation per day basis. So when you introduce a multiplier like that, the fines can get quite enormous. They have a lot of latitude, EPA, on how to issue these penalties. Okay, so often if facilities run into a lot of RCRA violations, a lot of it can be traced back to the employer's training program, how robust it is, how well they're covering all the employees that it's applicable to, and so on. So it's a big piece of the puzzle. Okay, so sort of concluding this, the generator really has to make sure that all the employees that are performing hazardous waste related tasks are trained in the applicable requirements for that particular state, and those requirements, of course, need to be communicated in a way that the employee understands it and can use that information. There are some other training requirements that are applicable. I did mention the HAZWOPER emergency response requirements. Because under RCRA there is that preparedness and prevention provision, as well as specifically mentioning chemical spills, emergency response in the RCRA training requirements. That's one of the reasons it's important to take a look at those HAZWOPER training requirements for spill response. Again, 29 CFR 1910-120 paragraph Q is where you want to look for that. That, by the way, is annual. The HAZWOPER training is an annual competency that's required. Anybody that's involved in shipping out hazardous waste, in other words, they're performing a task that would fall under the Department of Transportation's hazardous materials regulations, such as choosing the shipping containers, doing the final packaging of the waste, putting hazardous waste stickers, DOT, diamond, hazard labels, and other markings on the container, filling out hazardous waste manifest forms, signing off on those forms. Those are all pre-transport requirements that fall under the DOT's hazardous materials regulations. The good news there is that training is required every 3 years, not annually like a lot of the large quantity generators have to deal with. The hazardous materials training also is independent of generator size. So even if you're a very small quantity generator shipping out hazardous waste, the DOT training requirements would apply even to those folks. Dangerous goods training, not related to hazardous waste. If you're trying to ship your hazardous waste internationally or by air, you probably have some pretty serious issues to evaluate. So it's not really a topic related to hazardous waste, but it is related to hazardous material shipping. So the International Air Transport Association dangerous goods regulations kick in when you're offering hazardous material, not hazardous waste, for transport by air using carriers such as FedEx Express or shipping it internationally. Of course, there's a lot of OSHA standards that overlap a little bit with hazardous waste activities, especially things like material handling, ergonomics, forklift use, and so on. So obviously you want to make sure that all the applicable OSHA training requirements are being fulfilled. There's a punch list there of 15 of the most common OSHA standards that have a training requirement associated with them. And at this point, we are going to open it up to questions. And I'm going to turn it over to James to kind of guide us through the question process.
Thanks, Doug. And we do have a couple of questions that have been filtering in, so we'll open up the floor now. We've got plenty of time, so get your questions in while we have Doug on the line. Before we get to those, and while you're typing them, just wanted to reiterate that we will be sending an email tomorrow. So for those who came on a few minutes late, you'll get a copy of the presentation for your reference and to share with colleagues, as well as the recording. We'll also be sending a link to a short survey, so we'd appreciate your response to that. Let us know what you thought of this webinar, ideas for future topics. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And then I also encourage you to check out our list of upcoming hotel trainings. So Doug kind of alluded to a couple there. Most are in New England, but we do have the ability to kind of personalize some trainings on site for large enough groups. So I'm going to shoot over a quick link in the chat box if you're interested in taking a look at that while we go. So Doug, if we can advance to that last slide, I'll also share your contact information. There we go, right at the bottom. So feel free to shoot Doug a note if you have a question or any questions about his trainings that he conducts as well. So that does it for the wrap up. Let's take a look at the questions that have come in so far. And I will start with a question from Sarah. Doug, do DOT certified employees require RCRA training too?
That's a good question, Sarah. So if you have an employee that's already trained in the DOT hazardous materials regulations, that training is related to offering any hazardous material for transport, whether it's hazardous waste or whether it's virgin materials. So it's kind of independent of hazardous waste requirements. So the question really becomes, is that DOT trained person, do they have any hazardous waste responsibilities? Either shipping the hazardous waste, signing the manifest, or internally managing the waste. So that's going to answer your question. So they're related topics, but different. They're two different animals.
Thanks for clarifying that. And so Anne wants to know, what is required of an organization whose tenant generates the waste? And we assume that the tenant is compliant.
So that can be a little bit tricky, because what it's going to boil down to is who's the generator of the hazardous waste. And this can actually be determined contractually. So for example, if a service company were to come in and maintain a piece of equipment and generate a hazardous waste as a result, there's two choices there. The service company is the generator of the hazardous waste, but the host employer or the landlord or another party could take responsibility for the waste and become the generator if they so chose. So it all boils down to determining first who the generator of the hazardous waste is, and that's the party that first causes it to be regulated as a hazardous waste. So I think that's where you have to answer that question first, and then everything will flow from there. The generator will be responsible for all the compliance.
Great, good advice, and I hope that answers your question, Anne, and if not, feel free to follow up. I've seen a couple of hands go up. I know we have a hand raise functionality. Instead of doing that, if you could just type your questions in, there should be a little questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen. That's how we'll be able to get to it. And there's only a couple left, so we'll get through those. Rhonda wants to know, for the other training requirements you presented at the end, are they required for all personnel handling waste or just EHS personnel?
Yeah, it really depends on the specific training. So, for example, the DOT hazardous materials training would only be applicable to employees that are performing a pre-transport function related to the hazardous waste, not just handling internally. Things like the forklift training requirements under OSHA would be only applicable for an employee who is operating a powered industrial truck. So you really have to look at the applicability of each of those to determine that. It's not an automatic thing where a waste handler would need all of that stuff.
Excellent.
And HAZWOPER would be related to what role the employee would have during a chemical-related spill or emergency.
And it looks like that'll do it content-wise. There's a couple logistical or location questions when it comes to trainings that we offer, Doug. For example, Archie wants to know, do we offer any DOT training towards the seacoast of New Hampshire? So maybe I'll just let you talk for a minute about some of the trainings that you lead.
Okay, we currently don't do any DOT training in the New Hampshire seacoast area, where I happen to live, by the way, which is kind of a shame. The closest we get is probably Woburn, Massachusetts, as far as anywhere near New Hampshire seacoast. We seem to get a lot of attendance, in areas surrounding Boston, not too far out. Our open enrollment schedule, again, is up on our website. It does have a big emphasis on New England, Massachusetts. So we do have events coming down in Maryland, and we hope to be expanding that to additional states as well.
Thanks. And as you were talking, we got two more questions. And since we have time, I think we can take those. Raymond asks, say a scientist puts solvent waste in a satellite accumulation area for lab services to pick up. Do those scientists need RCRA training?
They do unless the specific state exempts them from training, and that happens occasionally, not very often. If you look at the federal requirements, though, that person that's managing that satellite container does have to know certain things and is subject to the training. So, for example, they would have to know what's hazardous waste and what's not, what can go in that container and what's not, how to maintain the label. They'd have to know the closure requirements. They would have to know when it has to be dated and moved to another area. In some states, those containers might have to be inspected on a recurrent basis. So it really depends on, A, does the state exempt those people specifically? And then B, what do they have to know? And the satellite management standards can also vary state to state. One also thing, going back to Archie's question about New Hampshire Seacoast, keep in mind that if you attend a hazardous waste training session, make sure it's covering the state requirements for your state. So we don't have any New Hampshire specific open enrollment events. So if Archie needs to go to something that covers New Hampshire DES requirements, he's going to want to go to either the state coordinator class or something we could do on site for his company.
All right. And
there are also, I'm sorry, there are also some other national training providers that do hazardous waste training all over the country, but that's very often just federal standards. So again, check with those providers to see if they're covering anything specific to your state as well.
Got it. Thanks, Doug. And our last question of the day, Carol wants to know, if our state hasn't yet adopted the new regs, do we just comply with the old ones until they do?
That's exactly right. So if you're in a state authorized program other than Pennsylvania and New Jersey, you would follow the current state requirements that are in effect right now. And again, all those states will be mandated to make some changes by next summer. But yeah, so it's in a holding pattern for most states right now, and so continue to follow the current state requirements, which supersede the federal requirements, until the state makes changes.
All right, I think that'll do it. Doug, thank you for getting us up to speed here on the RCRA training requirements. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Great questions, and we hope you learned something here today. And if you have any additional questions, again, reach out to Doug or follow up to my email that I'll be sending tomorrow morning with these resources. So that'll do it. Thank you so much. We hope to see you on a future webinar. Doug, any closing thoughts?
Just thanks, everybody, and thanks, James, for putting this together.
Of course. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.